So what are the problems with paradigms? Well, if we're starting to talk about issues of consciousness, spirituality, religiousness, this is not something that science has typically studied. Science typically tries to stay, as you heard in the morning, in the material realm. It's much easier for us to do an experiment looking at molecules and looking at the biology of what happens during a certain disease, as opposed to trying to get at something which is extremely subjective, something that is often very personal, and ultimately something which is very difficult for us to really get a good hold of. It's very problematic to do that. Spirituality, consciousness, these are all experientially driven. If I ask you if you're conscious, you all will say, yes, I'm conscious, and yes, I have consciousness. But how do you prove that? How do you try to get at what that really means for you as an individual, and how can you try to convince somebody else outside of yourself that you actually have these kind of attributes? So this is part of the problem that science has in trying to explore these questions. Now, again, spirituality and consciousness tend to be something which is very experientially driven, but that is a form of data, and actually that's in and of itself a very interesting issue and problem, which is what we, or what anyone, will decide to accept as valid data. Because most scientists will want to see the randomized double-blind controlled trial so that they can utilize that data to help them decide how to give care to the next person who's going to come into their office, for example, if it's a physician. On the other hand, if we are then going to look at religion and spirituality, how do we start to think about applying science to that? Is that data relevant? I was asked one time by an interviewer when they were talking about Richard Dawkins, who I'm sure most of you know is kind of one of the leading atheists in the world today. And they said, well, you know, he says that why does people believe in God when there isn't a shred of evidence? There's no proof that God exists. And I said, well, the problem is how you define evidence and how you define proof. Because if you go into any church or synagogue or mosque and you ask people, do you have proof that God exists in your lives? Almost everyone in that place will say, absolutely. And they will point to all kinds of evidence that they have that God is in their lives. Unfortunately, a lot of scientists will say, well, that doesn't count as evidence. And I think that's where, again, we have to start to get into this dialogue is what should count, what shouldn't count, what issues do we need to look at, how do we define those terms so that we can better assess what things and what data points we should actually accept or not in our overall world and scientific view of things. Now, ultimately, one of the areas that is very interesting to me is the area of mystical experience, because here we see a true altered state of consciousness. People are really getting their own consciousness to another level, something that is different than what we would typically consider our normal, everyday consciousness. And if that's the case, what do we make of those states? What do those states mean? They're giving us a different perspective on the world. What does that mean? Do we accept that as real? Do we accept that as psychotic? And how do we make those decisions?